Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 4 of GraphQL Architecture Masterclass, where Carlos, myself, and a few of our colleagues walk you through some important architectural issues that we see with respect to APIs and GraphQL APIs in particular. And we talk through what are the best practices, and then we show a demo of how in Steps N, we have tried to incorporate some of the best practices to actually enable you not to just implement GraphQL, but also actually do it well. Today's session is on federated data. Obviously, this is a very important session for all of you who have thought about GraphQL, and we'll walk you through what are the various questions that you've got to address and what are the pros and cons of various approaches, and then obviously about GraphQL steps in implementation also. So a small word about us. My name is Anand Chingran. I am the CEO of StepZen. And prior to that, I was the CTO for Apigee, and I've done a few things at IBM with respect to databases. On to you, Carlos.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Carlos Eberhardt. If you've been watching previously, I've said this a few times before, but I'm lucky enough to have worked with Anant for several years now. I work with our customers at StepZen trying to solve their interesting problems related to GraphQL and more and more often federation, which is the topic of this talk today. So this should be fun.
Awesome, Carlos. It's been a pleasure working with you and kind of preparing for these webinar series too. Okay, so we've got 4 topics, and then we'll open it up for questions. One is that we have actually, even before we started StepZen, we have seen a lot of API implementations, and we have seen, Carlos, as you and I have talked a lot about, that in some of the medium to large size organizations, how do teams kind of independently innovate and yet kind of come together? So we'll talk a bit about some of those challenges. We'll talk about how GraphQL in general and GraphQL Federation in particular addresses some of these issues with respect to team structure and organization structure. Walk you through kind of 2 major approaches to federation. There's a lot of kind of terminology soup out there, GraphQL stitching and object stitching and federation, which is kind of become synonymous with some vendor out there. But we'll kind of try to demystify and tell you what we believe are really the 2 right ways of doing it. And then we will talk about steps and implementation of federation. Okay, so with that, let's move on. So the core problem that all of you are addressing or want to address with your world of APIs, and in particular with respect to GraphQL, is very simple, that the data is where data is, right? As much as your organizations are trying to bring all the data together in a data warehouse, for example, or a data lake, or its derivatives like lakehouse and everything else, the fact is that the data every day is born in multiple silos, and therefore, while you're trying to bring it together, the fact of the matter is that people who are building applications still need access to the data wherever it is. So with that kind of core problem to be solved, your teams, your colleagues, kind of try to figure out how you're going to solve this problem. A very standard approach, the one that we saw in Apigee, was to go ahead and have these teams that sit on top of some data sources, sit on top of some domains, kind of build out their own API. So you may, from your kind of warehouse, may build out your scoring API or a customer journey API. Your enterprise application may have kind of a 360-degree view of the customer. So you build out a subscription API. You may go and use some third-party services like Google to build out Geo API, or leverage the Stripe API and customize it for your payments. And you may have microservices built on your kind of homegrown technologies to kind of deliver products and delivery and whatever else it is. But now you've got these teams that are kind of building out these sets of APIs. Carlos, you've seen a lot of this, right? So what's your observation on how people observe this, practice this kind of domain fragmentation and API building?
Yeah, I have seen a lot of it. I think what you've outlined here is sort of the default approach that people take. And I'm not sure it's always the right way to do it. And I will say, so the domain approach is the right way to do it. What I worry about sometimes and what I've seen is where um, it's either the domains are decided upon too quickly. For example, maybe you have a customer domain. And the situation there is a little unique because customer to someone who's in the marketing department means something different than customer to someone who's in the shipping department, for example, or the billing department, right? I don't necessarily want my marketing team sending emails or you know, paper mail, I guess if people still do that, off to someone's shipping addresses, right? I probably want it going to a singular address of where that information is supposed to go. So, and other people have talked about this in like the domain driven design books, and there's a lot of content on this, but understanding that it's not always as simple as just putting a single sticky note on a whiteboard that says customer on it and wrapping a domain around that is not always the right answer. And I think that's created a bit of a challenge for teams working on this in that, you know, doing the domain design can be a little bit harder than it looks like at first blush. Now, the challenge when you're in an enterprise then is when I've got third-party services and SaaS services, I really can't break those apart, right? I you know, the Salesforce is Salesforce. I don't get to go in and kind of change their definitions for things. So I think this is a problem that puts itself on a whiteboard really nicely, but when you start to dive into it a little bit more deeply, you're going to find that you need flexibility to kind of control who is essentially the sole technical authority for a piece of data, right? The customer data, not all of that customer data may live in that one service. It may need to come from different services. So it's not a minor challenge, I guess is my long-winded way of saying this is a hard problem to solve.
That's exactly right. So the kind of the trade-off is, look, go independently, do what you want to do, but obviously that kind of creates some challenges. And just to kind of put a picture to that discussion that Carlo just had, right? What you typically end up with if you go to portals. So, for example, here's a portal. I've taken some banking portal. I've taken some on the bottom left, some logistics portals. You can have anything else. What you typically find then is that from a developer experience perspective, there is just kind of a sum of parts that reflect what each of these different teams have kind of come up with, and the developer then has to kind of navigate and negotiate across all of them, and then obviously, as Carlos pointed out, stitch things together when needed.
Well, and this is another really interesting point. Now, and you know, I don't know if this is a good or bad example. Banks have a lot of things to worry about, but it's another interesting perspective to take, I think. And one of the things that I saw teams do a lot when they were starting to go down this path was to look at their internal needs and start thinking about domains that way. So, like I just said, right, customer is not always customer from your internal perspective. However, as a customer of you, I am just one thing, right? If I need to get my information from your services, I don't want to have to go to 6 different APIs to do that, regardless of what that data is, because it's all just, you know, I think of myself as a single unit. So perspective on how you're designing these things matters a lot. And in some way, and we used to talk about this all the time with APIs, some way of thinking about a separation between what you're producing and the domain model for the producing systems and the domain model for the consuming systems is important, right?
Okay, you're a straight man. So let's kind of boil this down to what problems that need to be solved. So, for example, so basically what happens is that this kind of approach of let's kind of create APIs, hopefully well-designed APIs, definitely well-designed APIs, but still APIs that are driven by teams, kind of poses problems on both sides. We've talked a lot about kind of the production side and consumption side, but let's kind of bring those things together. So on the top, I've shown a developer, and he or she needs to kind of assemble data from these kind of multiple APIs. And she then has to kind of think through what are different authentication protocols that you might have, what's the different shape, how do I actually pay for these services, the specs, data inconsistencies, you name it, right? So there is a lot of cognitive overload on kind of the consumption side. Once you say that, look, we are just kind of a garden of independently built and independently curated APIs, right? And it's fine. It kind of gets you started, right? But then what you've done is you've kind of shifted some of the burden onto the developers and some of the hard burden sometimes in order to kind of mix and match data and everything else. And obviously, therefore, all of you say, no, that's not good enough. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that the teams kind of who are building out these APIs kind of cooperate and interact with each other so that the experience of the developer on the top is nice. But then you've got your own sets of challenges that you've got to kind of take care of. How do you actually make sure that you have the right governance? What are the standards that everybody follows? Too many standards will slow people down, but too few standards will create kind of complete inconsistent experience for the developers. And as Carlos pointed out, thinking through what's the domain view versus experience views, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have found is that having done kind of REST APIs and APIs in general for over a decade at Apigee, is that this represents one of the most complex sets of challenges for some of the larger organizations or even medium-sized organizations as they embark upon their API journey. Anything to add here, Carlos?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, because this is always, in working with companies, even mid-sized companies, this was always more work than people anticipated going into it. There was sort of I think some of it came from thinking from what I call sort of SOA style thinking of service-oriented architecture, where enterprises, we had this service, we had that service, we publish our specs for that, and we're done. When the API wave kind of hit, it sort of tipped that over a little bit and made people think, okay, well, now we need to worry about consistency and, like you said, naming standards and governance and things like that. And I think teams recognized that was a large job, but I don't know that they always recognized it was an ongoing job, because change continues to happen. So this is one of those things where if you're doing a large enterprise effort of this, it is a team effort, and it's something that it's not a short-lived team. It's cross-functional, kind of long-lived. We used to talk about this quite a bit back in the days of REST APIs. Now, one thing I think is interesting, and I don't want to jump ahead on you, but I do think that the GraphQL takes care of some of this stuff for us, but maybe not all of it.
Awesome. Obviously, there never is a silver bullet, but I don't know what the analogy out there is, but yes, but you and I, having done APIs for a long time, actually fell in love with how GraphQL can actually help in this problem. Right? So among all the problems that we listed, that Carlos and I talked about, one of the biggest issues is what I would call impedance mismatch. APIs need to go from domains or how kind of backend people think about stuff to experiences. And that kind of, what is the kind of layering that kind of is able to kind of go from backend view to kind of front-end consumption view, from production view to consumption view, from domains to experiences. Early on in Apigee, I think, Carlos, you were just joining, but Greg and a few of us had worked with Netflix and Dan Jacobson and Netflix, where we learned a lot about how Netflix kind of thought about this domain APIs and experience APIs. And they started to kind of implement things like backend for front-end patterns and sequencing of APIs, or they used to sometimes call it API chaining, kind of translation from one world to the other, so that different things can be reassembled and fragmented and defragmented, so that people who are consuming it just get exactly what you want. But there's a whole set of best practices that were beginning to come together to kind of solve that out of those 20 problems that I listed in the previous slide, that one problem of impedance mismatch.
Yeah. I was just joining Apogee when this was going on. What I really liked about this story was that it coming from my perspective of kind of coming from inside an enterprise. This sort of flew in the face of a lot of stuff that was done there, because you were creating APIs, these backends for front ends, very, very specific APIs for specific clients. They were, if there was a VCR, a DVD player that had a Netflix integration in it, it might be unique to that DVD player, and they'd have an API just for that. And from an enterprise perspective, it was like, wow, how are you possibly going to maintain and manage all that stuff? That's crazy. You should standardize and make something simple. And I really liked the story that they told here, in that tuning those experiences allowed them to actually move faster and not slower. Where the typical enterprise approach, the more of those things you have, the slower everything gets. And that's an example of one of those, but what if we tried it this way ideas that I just love, because it sort of flew in the face of the
conventional wisdom,
quote unquote best practice.
Yes, awesome, fantastic. So as Carlos kind of hinted a few minutes back, GraphQL can actually help in many of these issues. And what we want to do over the course of the next 20 minutes is kind of walk you through, if the core problem is developers want some view and that there's an impedance mismatch across governance and security and everything else, can GraphQL really help? Okay, and obviously the answer is yes. Okay, so one of the things that GraphQL has, it just kind of blew my mind, Carlos, as I kind of work through GraphQL, is that people get hung up on GraphQL as, look, I ask for these bits and I minimize the amount of data that goes from my backend to my mobile device. Yeah, interesting. Okay, but hardly the most important reason, or even close to the top 3 reasons why GraphQL is something that's just really fantastic. And I've kind of thought about this, and what I've realized is that with GraphQL, how the data is delivered is completely abstracted away from the consumer of the API. And what that does is that you can deliver that API, that data out of one GraphQL API or a graph over a set of GraphQL APIs, and the consumer doesn't know. And so what that leads to is this superpower, and that happens because there's this superpower of GraphQL where teams can build graphs, and those graphs can actually get combined and recombined. And that really, really makes a huge difference with both from kind of the producing side of APIs as well as the consuming side of APIs.
Yeah. I think I was in kind of the same spot you were. When I first started learning about GraphQL, I thought, oh, that's really great. I can ask for just what I want, which to me was a little bit like what we talked about Netflix doing with the backend for front end. But I had a single backend essentially. I could just say, oh, this mobile app is only going to get this chunk of data, and on the web client we're going to ask for everything, because we're probably not on mobile network, and we can display more at once.
Yes.
And I thought that was super cool. But you're right, as you dive into it, the ability to think about the data that you've got in an enterprise in a way that allows you to go from these very specific domain APIs and sort of building block things together in different ways, I think is the real power of GraphQL. And I think we're yet to see a lot of people dive into that as much as they could.
That's exactly right. And I get to talk to a lot of people and talk to people who both invest in GraphQL tech as well as people who use GraphQL tech. And obviously the kind of the ease of consumption definitely stands out as, oh my God, wow, I asked for some bits and I get those bits. But the real transformation will happen is when the backend teams realize that actually really, really enables this decoupling and allows for this layering. Obviously, with layering, you've got to kind of make sure that performance and other things come. But from kind of an team organization and architectural perspective, it is just simply wonderful what can be done here. So, for example, you can not just do this. Obviously, you won't, in the end, you'll not end up building one API. You can, for example, follow the Netflix model and create bespoke BFFs and everything else. And all of that is just a set of building blocks and kind of routing logic and everything else. And what that does then is that with GraphQL, because this kind of stitching together is built into it, you are able to do this kind of architecture that you can never do with REST APIs.
Yeah, and I think, that initial reaction of, I get to ask for the fields that I want is sort of puts you in a GraphQL versus REST sort of mindset. It's like, well, I could create a GraphQL API or I could create a REST API. What do I get? What is the difference? And you kind of land on that. I don't think people jump into it to this level when they're comparing them. And to me, this is not a GraphQL versus REST, because REST doesn't make this very easy, and GraphQL does. This is a different approach to, I guess, data federation than a REST API approach, which is a little bit more coarse-grained, I guess I would say.
Awesome. And so, whatever reasons you all are doing GraphQL, make sure that this is in top 2, okay, for the reason for doing it. It will, if you're having debates internally, REST versus GraphQL, and somebody saying this, that, etc., talk to them about this. This is something that will pay dividends, not just now, not just when your first API comes out, but as your API structure, as your org structure, as your team structure, as your organization evolves. Okay, so the way to kind of think about this kind of building blocks is, I like to draw analogy with many things, obviously, but in particular, what really made the World Wide Web happen was this kind of interconnections that allowed you to come in at one point, and then from that one point kind of go anywhere else. Now, it so happens that there was, and it was of course done with this href context concept. And so the key thing that, Carlos, I always think about is, what's the equivalent of href in this world of APIs? What are those lines that we are drawing between those various things? How can we make the traversal of those lines to be completely transparent, and what is the least amount of work that developers have to do in order to actually make all of those connections happen? But if we can make those lines, etc., be seamless like href is, then we have got the power of building out whatever graphs are needed within an enterprise or across enterprises that would be magical with respect to the API structure.
So when you say those lines, like the href links, that's essentially, rather than thinking about, you can think about edges and nodes of a graph, you could build that into a single API. You could write that with code and write the resolvers for all of that stuff. But this is, you're talking more about a federation or a stitching or something like that, where instead of one person owning everything, I'm bringing together things that other teams own and pulling them in. And that's where you're seeing the analogy, right? Because Google obviously links off to a whole bunch of other sites. I can build a site that links to anything, and those sites, they don't have to do anything. They're just there. They just exist, and I can point to them, right?
That's an awesome point. Exactly. So the thing about href is that the person who is creating that pointer doesn't have to tap the pointed to thing and say, look, I'm creating a pointer, right? Yeah. And so that allows for this kind of creation and explosion and Cambrian explosion of interconnections and richness of experiences. And that's exactly what I believe, what you and I believe needs to happen in this space, where edges and connections can be created by independently of everybody having to kind of come together and decide and say that, look, oh buddy, if you're going to kind of connect, let me agree and everything else, right? So that is where this kind of reduction in friction in kind of creation of these edges, etc., is fundamentally important. Okay, awesome. So enough talk. Carlos, would you like to show a bit of a power of Federation and GraphQL, and then we'll kind of get to how StepZen does it. But would you like to show that?
Sure. Yeah, I can show that. Let me know when you've set me active.
Yes, you are active.
Okay, awesome. So what I did just quickly was in thinking about, what would be an interesting thing to talk about. I pretended I've got sort of those, maybe not the subdomains, but I've got a domain of customers, and I've got a domain of orders, and I've created a GraphQL API on top of those. And so here is the customers one. It's a GraphQL endpoint that only has a few different things. I can search for customers. I can look at their contacts. So I've got a customer's query here I can pull up. And if I fire this off, I can see here I'm looking for customers where the credit limit's 500, and I just want the first 5 of them. I'm paging through them, and I'm getting this list of customers. So this is great. And if I wanted to get a contact name, I could, obviously I could do something like that, and I can get more information. Again, this is the power of GraphQL, right? Getting the bits of information that I want. But that's all that this graph knows about is customers. Now, similarly, I've got one for orders that has a few different other things, and this doesn't really know anything about customers, but it does have a customer ID that's associated with things. So I can look for customer orders based on ID, but that's all I really know about customers. And again, this is one of those situations where the domains need to be defined and thought about correctly in terms of that. So now I can retrieve order information and get details on things that were ordered. The concept of stitching these things together, or bringing these things together and creating something that's more powerful than the sum of the parts, is something that I've done here in what I would call I'm calling this enterprise. This could be, maybe this is just a graph for a customer service application, for example. And in this case, we can see there's actually, all the queries that are available from each graph is available here. The other thing that's interesting is that, and I'll just build this one by hand. I can pull up, the name, and now here I've actually stitched these two together. I've connected these two. So where previously I couldn't get orders related to a customer, now I can. So I can get the order date and the status for these. So I can pull these together, and I can see really quickly that this customer has one pending order, and I could pull up information about that and find out what that user needs to see. And again, the developer of this application doesn't need to know anything about the fact that these are coming from two different subgraphs. All that needs to happen is that the team or people putting together this enterprise graph know that there are ways to connect those two different subgraphs. There's nothing that's been done in this graph, and we'll take a look at the implementation a little bit later on. Nothing that's been done in this graph beyond pointing at the other two and doing a little bit of work to say, we can connect these two things together. So the orders graph and the customers graph don't have any idea that they're being used in the enterprise graph. They're just concerned with their domain, and all they need to do is build capability for that. And then in the enterprise graph, we pull those things two together, and we get more capability than the two of them separately.
So when you kind of mentioned this awesome, Carlos, when you mentioned the fact that the consumer doesn't know, right, whether it's coming from one or two. Imagine this world that you've got kind of a small team, and the team decides to kind of build out an API that kind of stitches together customers and order data. They may go against a microservice on one end and a database on the other, and kind of builds out something like this. And then over time, the team structure evolves, or governance structure evolves, and now you say no. Instead of this being delivered by one team, we are actually now going to have two separate APIs coming from two separate teams. But at the same time, you don't want your kind of internal org structures, etc., to affect Alice, who's a consumer of that API.
Exactly.
The beauty about GraphQL is that you can evolve your team structures and whatever else it is, and this kind of federation and stitching layer can kind of come on top and completely insulate the consumer from how your API structures are built.
Precisely. And I don't want to turn into a sales pitch, but one of the challenges with that is going to be managing that change, right? When for example, when the order subgraph decides to split out products into its own sub team, for example, I'm going to need to do some work to make sure that everything still works at that subgraph level. At the supergraph level, I'm going to be fine. But while I'm doing that work, I need to make sure that everything continues to work. So it's very important to have a good continuous integration and continuous deployment kind of process built up to support this that relies on automated testing. And ideally, I'm not writing a lot of code to make this stuff happen. I think that's the thing that I realized, back in that Netflix example. If you had to write a bunch of code to create all of these different APIs and maintain and manage them, from scratch with code, that's that old enterprise perspective that's not going to work, because it's just too much work to keep that stuff in order. But when you start to layer things together on top of existing services and have those best practices and good practices around testing and automation, then you can start to make changes very, very surgically without impacting everyone else. But you need to be thinking about it that way, and not, I'm going to just write a bunch of code that solves every problem.
Awesome. Okay, let's kind of now talk about how this particular magical federated API can get built. So I'm going to kind of take a control over and talk about how this can be done. So there are basically kind of two approaches. A common approach is, for example, an approach that Apollo uses is what I'd call object stitching. That is, a customer, you saw this customer data. Customer data can come from two different systems. You could have an API that delivers kind of customer information, Carlos's name and email and address and everything else. And then you can have a second graph that delivers other parts of customer information, in this case, customer orders. Okay. And so now you've got these two subsystems. Each of them are producing different parts of that customer object. And then a federation tier comes on top and says, for this part, go here, and for this part, go here. And as you can see, the only way you can actually join, if there's a way to identify kind of unique objects on both sides. And in this case, for example, the object might be ID. So this is a very common approach which says that the same object is being constructed from multiple sides, and the federation tier brings them together. A different approach is, for example, what we do in StepZen is to kind of follow that href pattern, Carlos, that I talked about, which is that the right side actually doesn't know anything about the left side. Okay, and it is the job of the left side to say that, now look, I want to expand and bring in, orders. And in this particular case, the way I'll bring in orders is I will connect the orders data is actually fetched and brought together by connecting with some query on the other side. So the central thesis on this side is that the data from one subgraph is used to feed a query in a second subgraph, and that returns a set of results that become part of the object defined on the left side. Okay, so these are basically kind of two different approaches, and because we are kind of firm believers in independence of team, and it's only the kind of the consuming side that should know about the production side, StepZen actually supports the model on the right hand side. But of course, if you've got stuff that you're doing on the left, StepZen subgraphs are also compatible on the left. Okay, so we'll actually just kind of show you what goes on, but our decision and our thought process on the left hand side was very much driven by kind of the independence of evolution and everything else that we see, so that everybody doesn't have to know about everybody else, and yet edges and graphs can be formed out there. Anything to add, Carlos?
No, I think I can see some appeal to the object stitching side in that you sort of have the same named thing in two different spots that you then can kind of merge together. I understand that, but having done a few of these, I'm not sure that I really care anymore about that. And I think thinking about sort of that independence and being able to, obviously you may end up with when you're working with GraphQL, you may end up with things like name collisions, but obviously there's ways to deal with that outside of having to make everyone agree on things. And I think having that flexibility and removing any kind of friction for people being able to independently evolve is really, really important. And I don't know if I would trade that for just about anything.
Awesome. And exactly. And then and also on the kind of query-based stitching model, just like, for example, in the web graph, if you kind of build some protection and other mechanisms in your query-based model, then you can protect direct calls to that query or indirect calls to those queries through the edges. So there are some kind of advantages and in our mind, lots of advantages of that. But obviously, that's kind of a decision that you will make. And if hopefully you'll go with the right, but if you decide to go with the left, then we have got also capabilities that support the left side of doing it. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point on the just quickly on the security. And I just another call out for to the one that you weren't here for with Sridhar. I think that was a good one. If viewers haven't seen that, we were talking about ways to secure GraphQL APIs, and that's very important when you're looking at the federation type situation as well. So understanding and thinking about security as you do this is really important.
Exactly. Because if your resolvers to resolve a query are different than edges that come from somewhere else, then now you've got to kind of figure out all the other things. So that's the reason. But there's another reason why we went with this approach, Carlos, apart from all the things that we have talked about, which is kind of href and security and everything else, is that it allows us to deliver GraphQL API and federation in the same way. So whether you're building an API out of backends or whether you're building an API of APIs out of a set of GraphQL backends, it's all done in the same way. You don't program your API differently than you program your GraphQL API. And this kind of what I had said, turtles all the way down or building blocks concept, like in href, the fact that I can href within a site and I can href across the sites, the mechanisms are exactly the same, was our inspiration in order to actually make this happen. Okay, so just to kind of speed along, basically our approach then is that you're kind of building out these building blocks, and your building blocks can point to backends, and you can point to a database backend or a REST backend, and then you can kind of bring these building blocks together and do a query-based stitching where the data in one building block feeds some query in the second building block in order for all of this to come together. But you can also use that same concept, but shift from a building block to be kind of a backend building block. You can take this work and make it one of the building blocks and build something else on top of it. All that changes is the backend is no longer database or REST backend, but backend is GraphQL backend. So if you focus your attention on the right-hand side, folks, what you can do is you can build out an API using these building blocks and steps in, and that then becomes a building block for something further up. But you can also take an API that is built in some other technology. For example, on the right-hand side, you may build it in AppSync, or you may build it in your favorite Kotlin library or Java library or JavaScript library or whatever it is. And it's perfectly acceptable for team A to decide to build something in steps in and team B to decide to build it something else. But this building block approach then allows you to actually compose the APIs on top. Okay, so if you kind of just think through this, the way we kind of think about blocks and connections allows us to do this kind of composition and supercomposition that allows for many of the problems that occur between production and consumption to actually be addressed. Carlos, would you like to show an example of how this is done in steps in?
Sure. Why don't you let me know when you've flopped over to my screen?
We can see you.
Okay. I'm just going to rebuild that enterprise graph example from before, and I'm starting with essentially just an empty folder. It's got an index file that's pointing to one other file we'll look at in just a second. But I'm gonna, if we look, I don't know if we can see that. Let me make that a little bit bigger. I'm going to do an import, and now what I'm telling it is I'm going to import that orders GraphQL endpoint. And again, this is import GraphQL. I'm providing some authorization header so that it'll do this, and we should fire this thing off. There we go. And then I can do another one of those for the customers one. Same idea. And again, as I not mentioned, this doesn't need to be running in the StepSend service. This could be something that I had written, using any of my other libraries or tools, could be running anywhere, because we're just introspecting that API and understanding what's available and pulling it in. And now that I've got these two guys pulled in, I can then do that stitching, that query-based connection, by extending one of the types and simply saying, hey, customers have orders, and here's where it comes from. It comes from this query called customer orders, which is defined in that orders subgraph. And that's all it takes to tie these things together. Those two graph endpoints, nothing has changed. They're still running as they are. Their schemas are still the same. But now we've created a third one out of those that connects them together and provides all of the capabilities of each one. And if you're thinking about a back-end for front-end pattern, if you think back to one of the slides where we had kind of an enterprise graph and then another graph off to the side, I could come in and remove some queries from some of these. I could put protections in different ways. So maybe I want to, maybe I have these APIs are protected for internal use, but this enterprise graph that I'm building is going to be exposed externally. I want to put some different rules on that. That can all be done relatively easily and just through configuration here. And I think one of the key points then you can imagine if customers change, what would I need to do? StepSend import GraphQL, and I get an updated schema from that. So it lends itself really nicely to building those CI/CD capabilities and workflows, so that you can really have triggers set up that will fire off, rebuild graphs, test them automatically, complain if something fails, so that those teams know, hey, I made a change to my API and it was being used in our enterprise graph and it caused a problem. Okay. All of that can be automated really easily. And I think that's, if I were thinking about this kind of in my old enterprise mindset, I'd be like, wow, there's a whole lot of stuff I need to write. And then actually, when you do it this way, there isn't much to write. It's very lightweight. You can deploy, a new endpoint on a server is 2 seconds of effort. It's not a bunch of provisioning and things like that. And I think all of those capabilities are what really kind of brings this vision to reality.
Awesome. So let me just kind of end this talk. Thank you very much. And as we talked about it, basically we made 3 points: that GraphQL promises to deliver better API architectures, all the problems that we talked about. And that, in my mind, is a bigger superpower of GraphQL than just ask for the bits and get the bits that you want. But then how that GraphQL is built across team structures matters a lot. Are you able to maintain that independence and yet bring things together when needed? And what we showed you was the approach that StepSend has taken, which is kind of a consistent approach across how you build APIs and how you build federated APIs. And what we didn't show you was that when you do these things declaratively, the way Carlos showed it, we can actually take care of a lot of the hard things in order to ensure that your GraphQL backends get rightly cached and everything else happens. Okay, so the thesis is that GraphQL enables better architectures, and how you do it is important. And what we want to put forward is the ease in which you can actually do it with us, and yet how you can actually maintain performance around it. So there is a lot more that you can do and learn about StepSend. We obviously talk about this kind of federated approach. We've got a set of capabilities in federation, and obviously you can get started with StepSend. Any questions?
Yeah, while we're waiting for questions, the only thing I'd like to add to kind of that previous slide is if anyone out there has some interesting challenges that they've run into, either trying to do federation or thinking about how they want to do federation. I know, we've talked with some customers about how they're going to manage these larger teams and how do you organize this stuff. I don't know if the link is on here, but if you go to our homepage, we've got a Discord link at the bottom. Hop in there and shoot us a message, and we can hop on a DM or figure out a call. And it'd be great to talk through some of these challenges, even just from a high level perspective. Not a here's how we'd solve it in steps in, but here are the things to worry about. I think everyone approaches this a little bit differently from what I've seen with big companies. The big moving pieces are the same, but the details are where kind of some of the tricky bits come in. So I'd love to have a conversation about that.
Okay, awesome. I don't see any questions right now. So thank you very much. Okay. Please join us for the last in our series. Obviously, what we didn't talk to you about is not just how you build the GraphQL API, but how do you kind of, there's no API without it being a service endpoint that people can actually query and mutate across. So how do you actually deploy, build and scale and deploy the GraphQL API? So we have another session coming up. And obviously, as Carlos pointed out, we are a bunch of API geeks who believe that GraphQL APIs should be done declaratively, and the connections between them should be the way we showed you, and that leads to much better runtime performance. So hopefully you'll give us a chance, but otherwise I'll see many of you in our next webinar series, which is a week from now. Carlos, thank you very much again. And with that, we are going to end this broadcast.